That I grew weary of the guilt I bore over my mother's death never decreased its capacity to cause pain. A whip always cuts better with use. And having become an expert at dancing with guilt, I took on the guilt of my betrayal of Anna and held it close to me. At first I had lied to her. I lacked the courage to injure her further. But the voice betrays, the words too, and the body jerks when it should be still, stiffens when it should be easy, the hands drop things, and the eyes try to escape, and a woman knows. And at last she came on to us together. Anna and I had built a nest together. Maybe it was ramshackle and hanging by small threads from a limb. Maybe it was swaying wildly in the wind. But it was the nest we had built, and we were both in it along with our kids. I could not give up Imogene, but I could not leave Anna. Still the time came when I could no longer sleep in our bed. My back to her, I could no longer eat at our table, my eyes unable to look up from my plate. When I announced that I was moving out of the house, Anna walked up to me very quietly and asked, "Why are you leaving?" "Because I have to," I said. She began to cry, and she cried for a long time. I moved into a small 3-bedroom house on the other side of town. I asked the children to help me move. Perhaps, I thought, I could convince them I hadn't abandoned them, even in my leaving. I remember the innocent child Kent and that small blonde angel Katie, then only 6. I remember their eyes, wide and hurt, as they helped me unload my things from the car. After I moved, I called Imogene, who after her divorce was still living in Casper. Sometimes she spent afternoons helping me make the Stark rooms comfortable. She had been an interior decorator for some time, and she knew how to do such things without much money. I had to grow up. I thought if, at 40, I could finally grow up, everything would maybe work out all right. Continued to live alone in that strange, small little house. Months passed. The loneliness grew like thistles. When Imogene and I were together, my loneliness disappeared, only to return when we parted. I longed too much for her. I missed my children too much. I was too guilty over Anna. Often I thought back about my mother. Was this the sort of inescapable pain she had experienced? I thought if I could escape the town, perhaps I could heal. Perhaps I would see Anna differently. Maybe there would be a place outside the trap. I also felt trapped by my possessions. I developed a plan. I would sell everything, leave Riverton, abandon the practice, leave my friends, leave my clients, leave my history, and I would run even from Imogene, and perhaps I could be free. Anna was in agreement. I rented the vacant Western Auto Store building in downtown Riverton. I took a full-page ad in the Riverton Ranger. I called the sale Spence's Last Remark. The sale would be on June 6, 1969. I sold all of my guns, my archery equipment, my paintings, our old clothes, new clothes, bikes, skates, fishing poles. They were all part of the trap, and I got rid of all of them. We sold our home, the Hidden Valley Ranch, my office building, everything, right down to the extra toothbrush. I would give up the law. The law was not an instrument by which justice could be delivered to the people. I had witnessed its failures for almost 20 years. I was sick of the deceit, the deviousness, the lawyer games of the judges pretending to be the guardians of justice when they were the handmaidens of the rich. The law had served me well, and I it, and we were even. I remember the night I told Imogene I was going back to Anna. Had to make one last honest try, I told her. I couldn't look at Imogene. I couldn't touch her to comfort her. The next morning, on a gray, drizzly day, I left with Anna and the children for Mill Valley, California. There we leased a house in the Redwoods. It was strange to walk on those streets, just another lost soul in cut-offs and sandals, where once I'd been somebody, admired, despised, but somebody to everybody. Here I was nobody. I felt as if I had died, and no one knew. But every day, sometimes a dozen times a day, I called Imogene. "Are you there, darling?" "Yes, I'm here," she'd reply. But still I couldn't leave Anna. I had to hire another shrink. "Get me out of this well with its oozy green sides," I said to the shrink, and after 2 months, I was finally able to crawl out of the well. Less than 2 months after I had fled to Mill Valley with my family, I called Imogene from a payphone to tell her the news. "I'm coming back, honey," I heard myself saying. Silence. When? I'm leaving this afternoon. Are you coming back for good? Yes, I said. When I returned home, Anna was waiting. She looked at me. I didn't have to tell her. Where are you going? She asked. I began packing my bags. Back to Wyoming, I said. I belong in Wyoming. Anna stood silent, watching. I said goodbye to little Katie and kissed her and whispered that I loved her and that I would never leave her and that I was leaving Mill Valley, not her. Then I was outside in the front yard. I threw my bag in the trunk of the car. You left your boots, Daddy, Katie said, running to me. I looked down. I was barefooted. Anna had followed me out to the car. Can't you come back in and sit down and say goodbye? After all of these years, can't you say goodbye to me? It was August 2nd, 1969, my father's birthday. In panic, I turned from her, slammed the car door, and drove off down the road barefooted, my boots still standing in the living room. The bed was a magical bed, I have no doubt of that. I have thought if any were so fortunate as to have slept in that bed, they could not but experience its benevolent power, for the magic of it would surely change their lives. A fine walnut mallard bed of the Victorian period, its tall headboard dominated the room. It had belonged to Imogene's Aunt Flo. The bedroom was on the second floor of one of those old English-style houses in Casper. At daybreak we sat quietly, propped up against our pillows, peering into the rising steam from our coffee. It was a good time of the day, the kids still in their bedrooms below, and it was in that magic bed where our lives took root and began to grow and bloom. My divorce from Anna had been one of those default affairs in an empty courtroom. All of the property and custody issues having been previously worked out by the lawyers, the assets split down the middle. That was in 1969, and within days after my divorce, Imogene and I had run off to Tahoe to get married. The Sunday morning shrinks would have said I had escaped one trap only to fall into another. But a trap of love is not a trap. It's heaven with a fence around it. In bed, Imogene and I talked quietly about the war we were fighting. We were a new entity with 6 kids, and we had a lot of enemies out there waiting. We knew that. The first enemy we had to whip was booze. Our morning sessions in the magical bed became our daily meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And most mornings we talked about my mother thing, as we called it. The same old hang-up, the guilt, and always the question, why? You can't deal with all of these thoughts coming in from every direction unless you're stone-ass sober. We beat the booze, and we began to win most of the wars. I was learning as well in that magical bed how to deal with that whip called guilt. One morning, shortly after we were married, Imogene and I were sitting in bed, sipping coffee, and I was thinking about the trial I had won for an insurance company the day before. An old man had been badly injured in a car wreck, caused by a drunk, a woman insured by the company we represented. The old man had been about to retire. He'd given up the best part of his life in the hell-hole of the refinery in Casper, making a living for his family, all those years waiting for his payback, his retirement. He planned to go fishing with his grandchildren, spend balmy days in the mountains with his wife. But that was before our drunk ran into him. It was over for him after that. Now all over, except for his pain, which would never go away. After the jury returned its verdict, Imogene and I had gone to Safeway to gather the fixings for a celebration. We'd filled our grocery cart, and when we rolled up to the checkout line, an old man was standing in front of us. Hearing our voices behind him, he slowly, painfully turned around, and for the first time I was up close to him. Up close, I saw his eyes were pale blue and watery, like Grandpa Spence's. It was the man I had just beaten at court. "Sorry the way your case came out," I finally said. I saw the marks of pain on his face. I heard his labored breathing. Before he had been the adversary, the person the law gave me the right to kill in the courtroom, the person from whom I could steal justice legally. The old man said, "You don't need to be sorry, Mr. Spence. You were just doing your job." Then he said it again, as if to convince himself. "You were just doing your job, Mr. Spence." He gave me a small, sad smile. I helped the old man out with a sack of groceries, and he thanked me. And Imogene and I went home, young, healthy, powerful, in love, the two of us off to celebrate having beaten an old, hurt man. It was that following morning in the magical bed that I said, "Imogene, is that my job, to cheat old men out of justice?" She was silent. She is a wise one, that Imogene, one who knows how to make great points with silence. I could still see the old man's weary face. I thought of my grandfather Spence and of my grandfather Flieger. I saw my parents, and I saw the hope that was reflected in their eyes when they looked at me. Even as a child I saw it. I was the product of the toil of those generations. I was their blood, their history. I was their immortality, as our children are ours. Surely they hoped that the devotion of their genes would do something more than work to the profit of the insurance companies. Surely they had hoped for something better than my cheating poor old men out of their justice. I jumped out of bed, threw on my clothes, and ran out the door. "Where are you going?" Imogene asked. "Gotta do something," I said. I drove to the office. "Gotta talk to you," I said to my partner Bob Rose. When I had returned from Mill Valley, he'd made room for me in his practice in Casper. "Bob, how can we do this for the rest of our lives?" I told him about the night before and the old man at Safeway. "I've been thinking about it a long time myself," Bob said. "Makes you sort of sick." "The money?" I asked. "We can make it," he said. I composed a letter to all of the insurance companies and other corporations Rose and I represented. They would please send their representatives to pick up their files. We would no longer represent them. And after that, I refused to represent any insurance companies, and any banks, and any more of those invisible creatures called corporations. After that, I represented the lost and the forgotten and the hated. I took on the cases of the people against the powerful. Over the years, my decisions seemed to somewhat muffle the demons. As for my mother, she began to hang out in the shadows and became a more silent observer. And sometimes, through the dim light of the early morning, when the first beams of the sun danced over the covers on our magical bed, I thought at last I saw my mother smile. Why had my mother, who had never exhibited the first suggestion of violence, turned the ultimate human violence on herself? How could my mother, who was sinless as any saint, have committed that one unforgivable sin? The ghostly finger continued to point at me, and although as the years flew by, the ghost more often stood quietly by, still the why of my mother's suicide remained a persistent pain at my core. As I began to write this book, I read anew my father's autobiography, The Evolution of a Hillbilly Kid, he called it. Perhaps during all of those painful years I hadn't wanted to look closer at my mother's last days, for fear that what I might see might magnify my pain. My father had written, quote, "Esther worked quite closely with this Bolivian fellow, Pastor Meneses. He was at our house frequently, and at all hours. We got word that Pastor Meneses had been killed by the Indians, stoned to death. It really shook Esther up. Every time we talked about it, tears filled her eyes. Had she fallen in love with Pastor Meneses? Esther was having trouble sleeping," he went on to write. "Several times I was awakened by her crying. I would ask her what the trouble was, and she would reply, 'I don't know, I just can't sleep.' I would roll over and hold her close, and she would quiet down." In my dream, when the music stopped, my mother and I walked from the dance floor to the edge of the crowd. I thought that we should get the matter settled between us. "Why did you leave us, Mother?" "I never left," she said. "Where have you been, then, all of these years?" I asked in my dream. "I couldn't sleep," she said. She was looking off into the distance. "I grew old without sleeping. And then I saw the natives circling around the man, and I heard them chanting and jeering. He was a smallish Bolivian with a mustache, and he had both arms over his head, trying to fend off the rocks that the ragged, barefoot, screaming mob was hurling at him. The stones landed on the man and struck his arms where he protected his head, and hit his back with a terrible thud of rock on flesh, and soon the man fell, and he took the fetal position, his arms still over his head. Then the mob moved in close to him, and at the edge of the crowd I saw my mother. She was horror-stricken, and her hands were at her face, and she was weeping. And in my dream I heard her crying, and after that the mob made quick work of the missionary, and his skull was crushed in. And in the distance I saw my mother running, and after that I never saw her again.
In the years that followed, Jerry Spence went on to try the renowned Karen Silkwood case, which elevated him into national prominence, a case in which the jury awarded his client a verdict in excess of $10 million. After that, he obtained a series of multi-million-dollar verdicts, including a $52 million verdict against McDonald's for a small bankrupt ice cream company, a $26 million verdict against Penthouse magazine for Miss Wyoming, a settlement in excess of $40 million for the workers against U.S. Steel, and numerous other multi-million-dollar verdicts. During the more than 20 years that followed the time frame of this book, Jerry Spence's court work has changed the face of trial law in America. He has successfully defended numerous first-degree murder cases, obtained acquittals for Imelda Marcos and Randy Weaver of Ruby Ridge, and has not lost a jury trial since 1969. He has never lost a criminal case, either as a prosecutor or as a defense attorney. For over 25 years, he has refused to represent banks, insurance companies, big business, big corporations, and, unless as in the Imelda Marcos case, there are overshadowing public issues, he also refuses to represent the rich and famous.